Give it to
Thank you for participating. Maybe you can come closer since there's empty seat in the front. So yeah. Thank you. One more minute. Okay, so let's begin our session. And thank you for participating. And welcome to the session, Regional GST, Impacts, Challenges, and Opportunities. This side event is co-organized by Iniciativa Climática de Mexico and the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Japan, in collaboration with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities in the Philippines, West African Science Service Center on Climate Change and Adapted Land Use, WASCAL, and Climate Works Foundation. So my name is Kurushima, and I will be the moderator for you today, and I'm from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And in this session, we will explore the increasing acknowledgement of the significance of non-state actors in the GST process, particularly from the regional aspects. So in doing so, we have speakers and panelists from Latin America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, and also experts to share their insights on the regional activities. So before we get into the discussions, let me introduce the independent GST and the focus of our session. Okay, so the independent GST, or we call it IGST, is a consortium of non-state actors working together. And our common goal is to support the GST from the actions and efforts of the non-state actors. We are an independent community, which the name Independent GST comes from, and we advocate together for a robust GST to empower countries all over the world to take greater climate action. So this is the structure of IGST, and many organizations are participating in our community. And the IGST includes a set of working groups, and one is the regional hubs, which we will focus today. And we have Latin America hub, West Africa hub, and Southeast Asia hub. And we also have thematic working groups, which are adaptation, equity, finance, and mitigation. And today we also have a speaker from the equity working groups. So later she will share with us her insight. Okay, so I want to keep my presentation short. So let's move on to the focus of today's session. And the point I want to make is that the regional effort of the GST are essential because our aim is to work toward the NDCs of each country, and a good understanding of regional and national effort is needed. And also, I would like to emphasize the importance or role of non-state actors in contributing to the GST process. And by incorporating the perspectives, experiences, and technical knowledge of non-state actors, we can bridge information gaps, enhance the acceptability and effectiveness of the GST result, and bolster countries' climate action efforts towards achieving their NDCs. So this is the two focus for our session, and we have two parts. And first, we will have representatives from the 3 hubs to talk about their regional activities. And then from the perspective of those who are working on GST and non-state actors in the region, they will talk about various topics such as the role of non-state actors and the challenges of GST. Okay, so let's move on to the first part. And we have 4 presenters. And the first speaker is Danica from the Southeast Asia Hub. And Danica Marie Supnet is the co-lead of the independent Global Stocktake Southeast Asia Hub and the interim director for climate policy of the Manila-based climate and energy policy think tank, the ICSC. With over a decade of experience in climate policy, research and development work, Danica leads the coordination with academic institutions, scientists, and other experts on the climate science research agenda to support the work with national and local governments and communities on policy and planning development. Okay, so Danica, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kay. Thank you to my co-panelists who are also here this afternoon and to everyone who's joining us in this afternoon session. I will give you a bit of a background of the Southeast Asia Hub of the IGST, which is a fairly new hub within the IGST consortium since we only launched the hub formally last May 16 this year. And before the formal launch, we conducted a series of consultations with civil society organizations, including academic institutions, think tanks, and also non-government organizations, as well as campaigners, advocacy groups in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Cambodia, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, and even all the way from Laos and in Singapore. So we came together through a series of online consultations and came up with looking at what are the focus areas of the Southeast Asia when it comes to climate action, whether this is in terms of climate adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. So here in our screen, you can see the key sectors that we are always saying that these are shared, similar adaptation and mitigation related issues and actions in the Southeast Asia, which we think would be the focus of the hub in terms of moving forward towards the next phase of the global stocktake, which is 1, energy transition, forestry and land use, agriculture, ecosystem-based adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. So this is also our submission to the Global Stocktake early this year. So it's a compilation of the consultations that we did before we formally launched the hub. And so focusing on the shared sectors that we have, what the Southeast Asia Hub thinks is that for us, the successful GST would mean that GST outputs are translated, of course, into the regional and national context, which can help specify concrete, locally driven policy and political actions from countries in the Southeast Asia region. And these should be based on the critical or the key issues and sectors that are shared within the region. So we are not looking at working groups that are strictly on adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation, because we want to emphasize on the cross-cutting issues, which are the sectors that I shared a while ago. That's why moving forward, as we move to the follow-up phase of the global stocktake and of course the NDC processes, we're looking at 3 working groups within the region, such as the research for policy, science for grassroots, to ensure that there are more information on the ground, and of course, the localized science and evidence-based approaches would be included in the policy research that we will be developing. And of course, enhancing or strengthening campaigns and advocacy not only at the regional level, but also at the local and country level as well. And we see this as important aspects, these working groups, and of course in leveraging a regional discussion, not only for non-government, non-state actors, but also for NSAs to really push for this discussion at a regional policy level, such as the ASEAN summits, and we have other policy groups such as the V20, the G20, and other groups where we can also engage with. So hopefully those will be the focus of the Southeast Asia Hub in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Danica. And our next speaker is Enrique from the Latin American Caribbean Hub. So let me introduce Enrique first. Enrique Maurtua Constantinidis is a climate change specialist with almost 20 years of experience in national and international climate policy. He is currently the coordinator of the IGST Latin and the Caribbean Hub. And Enrique leads advocacy initiatives in Argentina and Latin America. Since 2004, he has been actively involved in the United Nations climate change negotiations from a civil society perspective. So Enrique, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kay, and thanks everyone who joined today. So I am coordinating the independent global stocktake in Latin America and the Caribbean, and what we do is to collect and we convene organizations from across the region, trying to work on influence and to contribute to the process of the global stocktake. For that, we also work amongst the different organizations to try to develop assessment of our region and how the region is doing and provide tools for organizations that want to engage up to now into the global stocktake and beyond the global stocktake of this year to work in the new rounds of NDCs, because the mandate of the GST will be to have an informed new NDCs and more ambitious. And we, for that, if we go to the next one, please. So we have this small community of organizations where we actually work with organizations in Colombia or regional organizations or organizations in Argentina, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, and, and others. And that's where we try to coordinate efforts, products, capacity building sessions, webinars, trying to influence and trying to build those capacities in civil society to engage better with governments and at the processes of the GST. Then we try to have much more broad public outreach to the different communities and to broad civil society and even media. For that, this year we will be doing a regional assessment on the climate performance of the of countries in the region. This will have a collective component of how the region is performing as a whole, and then we'll try to compile information for 15 countries in the region. So it's not the entirety of the region, but we are doing this first approach to address some of the issues that are happening and giving a good context for then contribute in an independent way to that assessment and to the gaps and to the things that our countries could do to improve their NDCs in the way to COP30. So in that process, we are working quite a lot with our partners to make sure that there's public awareness and that everyone can engage in this process in different ways. Latin America is a region that has a lot of challenges when it comes to equalities or inequalities. It's a very broad region, large, and we have countries that goes with high middle income countries all the way to LDCs like Haiti. So, and everything in the middle. I normally like to say that Latin America is like the middle class of the world because of that. And that actually reflects in the fact that we have a lot of challenges. All the countries in Latin America are developing countries, but at the same time, we don't have some of the vulnerabilities of other regions, but at the same time, we do have capacities, opportunities to offer. That's why a successful GST can actually bring a lot of opportunities for the region in terms of access to the means of implementation and unlock that potential for renewable energy, biodiversity protection, and adaptation mainly, because we have the Caribbean, we have the Central America, and almost every country in Latin America is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So this GST can bring that opportunity to unlock the potential for new commitments, and also, and more than that, to unlock the potential for the implementation on the ground in the different countries. So with that, I think I can close.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. And our next speaker is participating online. And we will invite Kwame from the West Africa Hub. So let me introduce Kwame first. I hope the picture will come out. Okay. So Kwame Opong Hakman is an applied ecologist by training with more than 10 years experience in climate and environmental service delivery in West Africa. He is currently a senior scientist at WASCA, or West African Science Service Center on Climate Change and Adapted Land Use. At WASCO, he coordinates research and project implementation activities related to land use, land cover, and land degradation in West Africa. Part of his responsibility is to coordinate the activities of the IGST West Africa Regional Hub. So Kwame, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, so
can you hear me?
Okay, so you can start.
Okay, thank you so much indeed. I would like to again say that my name is Kwame Hakman. I'm supposed to have been there at the moment, but unfortunately I'm still in Burkina Faso at the moment. Now, it's really a privilege for me to make a presentation of our hub, and also particularly in this GST, or in this, technical dialogue, because this represents a key thing for us. Our stakeholders are always asking for action on the ground, and we are hoping that at the end of the day, we will be able to see reports that would translate to the flow of finance and so on in our region, to ensure that our people are able to have some actionable projects on the ground to alleviate all the sufferings of our people that are coming as a result of climate change. With this, I would like to just give a small introduction to our hub. Just like my earlier colleagues have said, our hub also represents a group of civil society organizations in our region, 15 countries in the ECOWAS region. But our focus is really about civil society organizations that are not only interested in the GST process, but are willing to contribute to the process in a meaningful way. Now, just like our colleague from Southeast Asia hub has said, our hub, even though has been in formation for nearly a year now, officially, it has been active in the space for nearly a month. And we launched the hub on the 24th of May in 2023 this year. And it followed a series of national workshops and also the co-development of the operationalization document of the hub. Now, because of the lack of capacity that we find a lot in our members, our hub really seeks to build the capacity of its members, the dominant of which are youth groups that are actively engaged in all kinds of climate issues in our region. And the idea of this is to ensure that these youth, which are very active, are given the platform to serve as a driving force for all the activities of our hub. Now on the right, you will see the steps that led to the formation of our hub, where we first did an initial stakeholder mapping to see those organizations that will be interested, and we analyzed what they are doing and so on in terms of climate policy. We also conducted a number of national workshops in our region, physical workshops actually, to co-develop the operational document or the roadmap document with them. And finally, we brought all of them together in a regional workshop where we validated the document and also launched the hub into full operationalization. Please move to the next slide, please. in terms of structure, as the others have mentioned, we are looking at, in fact, we are structured as you can see on the right, a core working group which is going to be supported by a secretariat, and also we have national networks that are represented in the core working group. In terms of our activities that we have planned over the next, few years, we are thinking about being able to actively participate in all kinds of events that relate to the GST. But just like Enrique has said, we also want to understand what our region is promising and doing in line of the NDC. So we are actually launching a new assessment of our NDCs across the 15 countries in our region, and also all kinds of policy that relate to that. Because of the capacity building needs of our people, we are going to embark on so many capacity building activities in terms of workshops and awareness creation in such a way that people really know about the GST process and they can contribute to it. We're also a part of this whole engagement, because our people are saying we need to do something on the ground. We are going to provide some small grants to allow youth-based and grassroots organizations to do some actionable projects on the ground. Also, as well, of course, the first GST comes to an end, we are thinking of translating the outcomes, particularly those that relate to our region, into actionable activities for the members of our hub to do in such a way that their actions are driven by the outcomes of the first GST. Of course, as Enrique and my earlier colleagues have said, we would also actively contribute to the revision of our NDCs in our region, and also contribute, of course, to the submission of inputs to the next round of GST. A key component of what we seek to do is also to raise funds for our activities, and finally to ensure that our activities are well known in the region. Also, the GST is well known in our region, to ensure that those who are interested in the GST can join the hub and also participate in a meaningful way. So, in summary, I would say we are also looking forward to a very successful GST. We are looking forward to seeing the flow of finance in different ways, in such a way that just like our people are suffering on the ground, we can actually participate in doing actionable activities on the ground to alleviate the suffering of our people from climate change. Thank you so much, and all the best to you, even as you hold this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame, and I hope you can stay until the panel discussion. Yes, okay. So our next speaker is Sonia from the Equity Working Group. And before I give you the question, let me introduce Sonia. And Dr. Sonia Klinsky is an associate professor at the School of Sustainability, Arizona State University. And she has a focus on climate equity at both domestic and international levels for most of her career. She is a co-coordinator of the Equity Working Group of the IGST, an associate editor for Climate Policy Journal, and is a board member of Climate Strategy, and is serving on the Aspen Institute Drafting Committee for an Ocean Carbon Dioxide Removal Code of Conduct for Responsible Research. So, Sonia, I want to ask you one question. And the question is, what would be the equity analysis of our regional work?
I love the giant question there. That's a huge question. So maybe one thing, the thing about equity is that it's multi-scalar. So it has components, everything from the community level right through the international level. So without going into depth of what all your regions are doing, I'm wondering if it might be useful here to present some thinking we've been doing in the Equity Working Group around needs-based assessment as a foundation for the global stocktake process generally. And the way we've been thinking about this, there's a group of us, the equity working group, many of us have been working in equity for a very long time. I think the group of us who's the newest to it has only been working on it for 10 years, and those who are the longest have been working on it for about 30 years. So there's quite a range of people who have been trying for a very long time to work on equity. And one of the things that we've started to work on is this idea of needs-based assessment, which focuses on being as articulate as possible about identifying bottom-up requirements for climate action as the essence of an equitable approach. The logic here is that by making these needs as concrete and specific as possible, it makes it more difficult to refute requests for support, and it makes it more likely that those forms of support will actually make it to the levels of action on the ground that they're needed at. So one of the things that I really like about all of the regional hubs actually is that the work they're doing resonates very clearly with a needs-based approach, in which the whole idea is working with regional partners from the ground up in a very honest, clear-eyed assessment of what the possibilities are and what would be needed to use Enrique's language, unlock those opportunities. We all know that there's lots of opportunities for action, and yet the resources needed, the kinds of supports that might be needed are not always linked to those opportunities. So the more the regional hubs can do the work of very clearly articulating both what the scale of the potential is and what exactly is needed where to amplify that fits very strongly with the work we're doing in the equity working group, where all of our focus is very concrete. What exactly are the needs? And the other thing I would comment about the regional hubs is I think they're a really interesting example as we look into the next round of the GST, why a regional approach might actually have a lot of benefits generally. Because one of the issues we see, as soon as you get to the global level and you're starting to talk about needs, they can become very abstract. And yet if you actually think about what's needed on the ground, implementation is the name of the game now. We don't need more abstract targets. We need concrete implementation. And doing that at a regional level has a lot more traction, and you can get much more specific and much more creative about solving real problems. And so I think what's happening here with the regional hubs, and I know it's taken a huge amount of effort to build them with all of the organizations, and that kind of slow but very solid bottom-up development to me is really interesting from an equity perspective, both in terms of enabling concrete support, but also in terms of potentially setting a bit of a pathway for the next round of GST, which I hope will have these kinds of much stronger regional focuses, because that's where we're actually going to get support for more equitable action tied to what people really need. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's, to me, is the strongest overlap with equity, is that really very clear, calm, but deeply powerful attention to concrete needs from the bottom up.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a great answer. And so this is the end of our first part. And now we will move on to the panel discussion with our speakers. And so Enrique and Kwame and Sonia will join our panel discussion. And, yeah, and we will have a new speaker, Helen, in the middle. So let me introduce Helen first. So Helen Magata is an indigenous Kada clan from the northern Philippines and is the coordinator of the Climate and Biodiversity Program of Teba Foundation, and also known as the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. So Helen represents her organization in IGST Southeast Asia Hub. So Helen will be speaking with us in the Southeast Asia Hub. So I will give the floor time for questions, but first let me ask them the question first. And I have a question for Enrique. So the first question is, what are the challenges that non-state actors, including civil society organizations, academic institutions, and indigenous peoples groups in the region face in engaging in the formal GST processes? So please tell us your experience.
Thank you, Kay, for that question. That goes to a broader situation that we see also here in the negotiations, which is the level of access that civil society can have to information, to the space, to the table of where the discussions are happening. So in that regard, that changes from country to country when you go to the national level. So we have a situation where, at least in Latin America, we don't have a huge a broad civil society that works in climate. So the capacities in civil society are not also as developed as in other countries. So those are different challenges that keep adding to the level of engagement. And that's why part of our work at the regional level is to build those capacities and try to connect what is happening here at the global negotiations with what the organizations are doing in the ground. That is something that is important because we don't necessarily need every single organization, every single person to be at this process, but at the same time, we need to find some balance, and we need to find that there is representation. Because as Sonia was talking about equity, if we want to represent in a global scale what is happening in the world, we need all the voices, all the different groups to be represented in one way or another. So we try to do that as much as possible. But again, the challenge is that, at least in my region, is a really big region with that really big variety of actors. And then at the national level, unfortunately, Latin America is a region that has a lot of challenges when it comes to human rights and when it comes to participation and the defense of the environment. We have like a region that is actually dangerous for indigenous people and defenders when it comes to environment or biodiversity. So that is something that is also something we have to acknowledge and something that we try to bring in different forms. So some countries might be difficult or dangerous, and some others might be safer. So we need to build that community, that solidarity with those groups, and trying to make sure that those situations are reflected at the global level and the GST, for instance, because that is also part of the climate solution. We need to address every issue to make sure that no one is left behind and that we actually build a better world. And this next round of NDCs, this next round of commitments actually give us that opportunity to start making changes that are more inclusive and give and so start showing some light into those problems and trying to move towards a way that we solve them. But yeah, most of the challenges have to do with that participation of civil society, had to do with the capacities that we have, and why not the level of development that we have in the countries and in civil society in general. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next, I will ask the same question to Kwame. So what are the challenges that non-state actors in the region face in engaging in the formal GST processes? So Kwame, can you hear us?
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Great. Exactly as Enrique has outlined in a brilliant way, our situation is not very different from what our colleagues from from the Latin America and the Caribbean are experiencing. Well, I remember that when we had a national meeting in Ghana, and when we started to tell them about this issue of GST and the assessment that is going on, and this commitment by all governments in the world against climate change, one of the participants said, then all of us have to be involved in this process. Yes, and this person who spoke is a representative of well, a number of workers. I mean, this is a labor union who participated in that event. So exactly, I mean, as my colleague has said, when it comes to having a platform for our people from the civil, for the civil society to actually engage in the process. In fact, such platforms are not there. But again, a part of the problem is that people don't even know that there is actually something called GST going on at all. People don't know at all. Well, see, I'll try to buttress my point this way. At the time when we did the assessment of civil society, we wanted to know the number of organizations that actually participated in the development of the NDCs. Now, it may surprise you to know that the number of people who participated in the NDCs, I mean, in terms of percentage, is higher than those who said they are aware of the GST process. So it means that there were some organizations, even the few that were invited to participate in the process at the national level, of course, they knew that they needed to develop a document, but then they didn't know that this document is actually moving into a second phase where a kind of assessment, has to be done. So in terms of awareness of the process, in terms of opportunities to engage or a platform to engage, it's simply not there. And that is why our hub is really an important platform where people can actually engage in the process, where we can bring together all their inputs in such a way that their voices can also be heard. But another aspect, which is, of course, it ties in with what we have said already, is the issue of capacity building. How do they participate in the process? I mean, people don't know. I remember that when we attended, I mean, the African Climate Weeks, but it may surprise you that apart from the UNFCCC event on the GST, none of the organizations spoke anything about the GST. So people simply don't know it. Well, of course, I understand that it's a new process that is evolving, so it's new to all of us. But I think that in our region, in terms of lack of knowledge, it's so much that we need really to build the capacity. So they need, in fact, if we tell them about the GST, the first question is, what do we do? So of course, it tells you that we need to build the capacity of our people in this process. Look, but again, how would they engage in the process, even if they want to participate? I mean, as a hub, we have a small funding, to engage, and we can, send a few representatives, which may not actually be adequate. So in terms of funding, it's really an issue on the ground. So this is also there, and so many other issues that relate to the climate change itself, which are there. But these broad issues, but I think that mainly is because the GST is new and it's evolving. Yes, and I hope that through the activities of our hub, we will be able to do some things that will bridge this huge gap in this knowledge space, and also to provide a good platform to allow them to actively engage in the process. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much, Kwame. And so next, since Helen represents the indigenous people, I have another question for her. The question is, aside from the major agenda point in the GST discussions, how important is it to consider cross-cutting issues such as gender and indigenous people's rights that are shared across the region? So, yes.
Thank you very much, Kay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, colleagues. I am with the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, who are also here in this meeting. I'd like to start by saying that Indigenous peoples, the contribution of Indigenous peoples to climate mitigation and adaptation is indisputable. 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world and about 22% of carbon in above ground, tropical and subtropical areas are indigenous peoples' areas. So I think that alone would answer the question of Kay of how important it is for indigenous peoples to be engaged in this global stocktake. Everyone gets impacted by climate change negatively, but the weight is a lot heavier on the most vulnerable, the poorer countries, the women, farmers, indigenous peoples, to name a few. And we don't see a lot of spaces at the national level for them to be able to engage. And the role, I'm looking at the role of the IGST as a hub, as a mechanism for them to be able to really input, to be engaged at the local level so that we have something from the region to bring up to the global level. But also it takes a lot of technology and it takes a lot of resources, as Kwame has mentioned, to be able to engage. So for instance, there's a report by the Rainforest Norway Foundation that says that less than 1% of all global finance for mitigation has been accessed by indigenous peoples in the last 10 years. So what does it say when, on the one hand, you're saying that the remaining resources you have are managed by indigenous territories, yet they only have this amount of finance. And that's very important when we want to look at the GST, the stock taking that is happening here. For instance, also in terms of the use of technologies, renewable technologies, just transition are huge discussions in the upcoming COP. But it's also very necessary to look at technologies that do not violate rights of communities, of indigenous peoples, because of course, all climate actions should be based on human rights. And when we talk about country-driven process, and I'd like to reflect a bit on the responses of Kwame and Enrique, yes, about the capacities of non-state actors to be able to engage at the national level. But I'd like to add another element to that, which is really, even if there was a capacity, are there really spaces for them to be able to engage? Because country-driven processes are often than not equated to only government processes, which may not necessarily engage non-state actors. And when we talk about capacity building, I think it would be good to note that capacity building will not only mean that there's a need for non-state actors, including indigenous peoples and women, for instance, to build their capacities, but I think it's also important to build the capacities of our government to be able to understand the context where we are coming from. And the last thing that I wanted to say is there's a lot of discussions in the global stock taking here saying that what we should bring to the GST are evidence-based. And again, for indigenous peoples, what does evidence-based means? Oftentimes, evidence means something that is written, something that is measured by numbers, and a lot of the elements that we contribute to climate change may not necessarily be quantifiable by numbers. Traditional knowledge, for instance, non-economic losses on loss and damage. And so I think in terms of what the IGST Hub can contribute really for non-state actors, including women and indigenous peoples, is to provide this platform to be able to show that, there are different ways of also providing science, scientific evidence, which might not necessarily be limited in that box of metrics that we know so far. I think I'm going to stop there and happy to contribute later as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And so we've got capacity building and financial resources as our challenges for the future. And so for the next part, we would like to ask the audience here for questions. If you have to ask to the panelists here, and Kwame as well. So if you have question, please raise your hand and we will give you a mic.
Sorry, a quick question. Is there any plans to open other regional hubs in other parts of the world, other regions so far? Or?
Casey. Casey.
Not yet. No, where I think it's been really exciting to see each of these three develop and letting them sort of develop as they need to. But I think we're trying to now figure out how are they really delivering here with this stock take. So that's our focus right now.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Oh, okay, sure.
We're waiting for questions. I just wanted to add on to something that Helen mentioned. In the first question, you asked me sort of how these hubs could deal with equity. And there's a framework for equity I use, which I think people in the audience might find really useful, and it might be useful to the hubs as you're thinking about how to include equity in your work. When we work on equity, people often focus on distributive equity, who gets how much. But that's only one way of thinking about equity. I would like to propose that people think of equity in at least three ways. One is the distribution, who gets how much of good things and bad things. The next one is procedural, who gets to really come and has a seat at the table, which is exactly what the hubs are really great at doing and trying to make sure that the procedural justice component of this is amplified in a way that relying on the international level alone simply can't do, because every person cannot come to the international level or every institution cannot send somebody, but the hubs can really help this procedural justice dimension. And the last one is one that the community at large doesn't talk very much about, but might be the most powerful one of the lot, which is what we call recognition justice. Recognition justice asks us questions like, whose narratives are being heard? Whose knowledge is being seen as valid knowledge? And this speaks exactly to the point that Helen was bringing up, that in a conversation like the Global Stocktake, quite often it gets dominated by very technical information, which may be quite far removed from the lived experiences of communities. And that other kind of knowledge we would see as a form of recognition justice, that the knowledge of lived experience of communities on the ground must be brought into any kind of stock taking in order for that stock taking to be seen as a just stock taking. And this is another dimension on which the global hubs, I think, have a real benefit, because it's at that level where you can get into the diversity of kinds of knowledge. So there's not just, for instance, one indigenous knowledge, there's many different kinds of indigenous knowledges, that the only way you would be able to do that is to have these more regional conversations where people can bring that set of knowledges forward. So that's just another way that I would invite people to be thinking about how important these kinds of regionally, really community-based assessment processes are if we want to push for an equitable GST. And it's that recognition part that often drops out, that it is that diversity of kinds of knowledge that you have to have these locally based regional assessments for if you want that to really get heard, because it simply gets lost at the international level, in my experience.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. And so maybe I will ask from my side a question to the panelists. Kwame, you have some comments?
Yes, I have a question for Sonia. It's such a great privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much for making the time to come. I think that the issue of, equity is really an important one. But then I think that listening to you, the issues have been how to make sure that our members are, say, represented, as in their voices are heard and so on, in the different submissions that you have made. But then my question is, as a hub that is going to move into full operationalization, but do you have any specific, suggestions to ensure that equity issues within the implementation of the hub, are taken into consideration, and that no one is left out and so on? Any specific advice, for us, in the day-to-day implementation of the hubs? Thank you very much.
I mean, to be honest, Kwame, every time I talk to you, it sounds like your hub is doing such an amazing job at being inclusive that I think actually you could probably teach a lot of other groups about how to do a really equitable process. I mean, everything that you've talked about in terms of, I mean, I know from last year as well when we met, you know, the amount of effort that you've invested in going to various community groups, really trying to reach out to everyone, your focus on youth, you know, gender-sensitive approaches, thinking about different knowledge systems. These are all really the kinds of things that we would be thinking about from an equitable approach. The only other element of this is, and this might be for all of us when we're thinking about assessment from an equity lens, when we're using something like a needs-based assessment, that the heart of equity there is trying to understand needs, and those may or may not be framed in the language of climate needs. Those might be framed in the language of immediate needs, or maybe people are using language of development, but you can see the climate component. So one is being very open to how people are expressing needs and not putting a lens on it that disqualifies certain needs as that's not climate related, because actually it might be. And then the other part is understanding what resources people have and what they could do with extra resources, and that helping them articulate. So another part of this is often groups may not have the capacity to fully articulate their full range of visions, what they could do. And so sometimes some assistance can be useful in making sure that groups are able to articulate their needs in ways that you can then collate and translate. So, I mean, everything I've ever heard from the hub that you're running sounds like you're doing an absolutely amazing job, and I would love to come watch you do it because I'm sure I could learn a lot. So from an equity perspective, I mean, that kind of deep engagement you're doing seems like you're totally, seems like you're doing an awesome job.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kwame and Sonia. And let me ask the panelists one question. So the question is, what contribution do you think non-state actors can make to the GST process through the iGST activities? So anyone can answer this question?
Again, I think the role of the iGST hub as a hub is to bridge that gap from this global space to our local communities. And what it can do is really bring that voice, bring that perspective from the ground up. And that's how the global stocktake should be done. Actually, one of the things that we were discussing, we had this workshop in Manila, and one of the things that we wanted to do is, how is it possible to do like a local GST, local stocktake, no, like a parallel stocktake to validate what the global report is saying. Because oftentimes when we do aggregates, a lot of these nuances, a lot of these elements become insignificant. So for instance, again, one example is, I'm reminded because of what Sonia said about equity, how much really indigenous peoples and women and local governments, for instance, get from all of this increasing global flow. Because what we hear from many states and governments here is that they say there's an increasing financial flow from the developed countries to developing countries. And that's good news. However, when you go to the local level, where do this money go? They report on mitigation. This is how much money went to mitigation, and this is how much money went to adaptation. But if you really look at the figures, do communities access this? I mean, how did it, for instance, improve local sustainable livelihoods? And a lot of these questions are not being seen when we do when we see a final document of a global stocktake. So yeah, that regional hubs can bring these elements of all local indicators, for instance, of what a successful global stocktake should look like.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to go? Yeah.
Sure. I think that the role of civil society is important, and I think that that is in the formalities, like it's stated everywhere. But the truth is that it's up to us to actually make it true. Like we normally have to have that moral responsibility that we have back in our countries, in our territories, to make sure that that is something that we make the implementation of the Paris Agreement a reality. So we are one of those elements that actually brings the accountability of the Paris Agreement in. So we will have this Global Stocktake. It will ideally come up with recommendations. It will ideally come up with identification of the gaps and where many of the NDCs of the 2025 will have to improve. And it's a role for us in that process after the GST concludes is that we actually can make sure that that outcome of the GST is implemented, that every country follows an inclusive and participatory process for a new NDC. So the new round of NDC is more inclusive, includes civil society perspectives, and across the board, indigenous people, gender, and all the actors that has to be involved, because not all the NDCs have been done in an inclusive way, and there is room for improvement. And I think that that is something that we need to address when we actually go back to our homes, go back to our countries, and we, in the hubs, we're actually trying to do that as well, like try to push beyond the GST time, which is going to conclude this year, and then what next? What next? We have to work, we have 2 years, a maximum of 2 years, to have new NDCs and then connect that with reality, with what's happening in the ground, to work more about the implementation. Because in the end, we can have as many targets as we want, but in the end, what we want to see is to change the people's realities on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, okay, Danica.
If I may add to the conversation, so I would like to emphasize also the importance of trusting everyone within our region, especially the civil society organization. Trust that we have a huge or a broad expertise as well. And those are the things that we need to harness together, like my co-panelists had mentioned, going towards engaging with our governments. And I think for the Southeast Asia Hub also, it's quite difficult also for us to harness those expertise, especially that we are not, let's say, for example, for other countries, a landlocked country that we can interact immediately with other countries, but then as much as possible, we are looking at possibilities of connecting with them in several issues or several platforms such as this one. But I guess what's really important is that we trust the expertise and the contribution of all civil society organizations within the countries in the region, so we can build that regional perspective that we want to push at the global level. Like Sonia also mentioned a while ago, the importance of a regional perspective will also bridge the gap, the information gap from the local, from the global to the regional, and of course to the local level. So thank you.
Thank you, Danica. Kwame, do you want to answer my question?
Yes, please. Thank you so much indeed for this very important question. I think that in addition to what my colleagues have already said concerning ensuring that we participate or we contribute to the revision of the NDCs at the different countries, I really do not know at the moment, as I'm sitting here, what exactly the outcomes of the GST would be. But if they are so concrete, I mean, in such a way that there are some regional perspectives, then the civil society also has a key role to play in ensuring that at least in the next round of the GST, well, we see an improved, picture of the climate situation of the world. Yes, and this, what I mean is that sometimes, as a scientist who looks at issues from space, I mean, looking at satellites and so on, many a time what we find is that you may be living in a city, and actually what is happening around you, but it's not very visible to you, even though you are living, but actually in the situation. Look, an example of that is that you may be living in a city, and how the city is changing over time, may not be so obvious to you until such a long time, probably when you travel to one area and so on. But of course, if you see a broader analysis of, let's say, land use change, for example, then you can see that, oh, actually in this city I'm living, it's changing towards this direction. Look, what am I trying to drive at? Our civil society organizations are those who are actually working on the ground with the people. And usually they define their problems based on what they see on a daily basis. But if the GST is so detailed enough, I mean, if the results are clear enough and has regional perspectives and so on, well, it will be now a good time, first of all, to translate these things into what it means for each region, and then try to encourage the members of our hub to align their actionable activities to these issues that have been raised as part of the reports of the GST, in such a way that, well, in the next round, of course, all of us can see an improvement, because it's not only government that's making contribution, but then the civil society are also making clear contribution in alignment with what is seen as the overall picture. I guess I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwame. So maybe we have 10 more minutes, and if there's any other questions from the floor. Okay. Is there a mic? Where's the mic?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question was about equity. So a lot of the different meetings I've been going to have been mentioning like a way to include equity in like the outcomes of the GST and like in the actions that are going to be suggested. So is there a good, I guess not like a good way to add like equity metrics or indicators to those actions? Like, is there a way to do that, or would it have to be like very contextual and like flexible? Thanks.
I'm assuming that's directed at me. So the debate about equity indicators probably is about a 30-year-old debate. There have been a variety of attempts to include equity indicators at different levels. Probably the most sophisticated approach came from the Africa Group in about 2013 and lead up to the Paris Agreement, in which case they were suggesting, the Africa Group was trying to argue for a bundle of equity indicators that would be kind of a basket. Because there's so much diversity of opinion on equity, early attempts to come up with kind of comprehensive indicators all politically failed. There was no traction, which is why the Africa Group came up with this idea of a bundle of indicators which countries could kind of pick out of several different categories and they could assemble themselves. The likelihood of that happening gets pretty slim. One of the insights from the very beginning has been, this process is kind of about, the depth of injustice in climate is so deep, it's actually kind of hard to wrap your mind around it when you really start to think about how this problem evolved and where its roots are. Depending on how deep you think about the roots of the climate problem, you go all the way back to colonization and the continued extractive industries. And there's no way that this climate agreement itself is going to tackle all of that or solve all of that. So the question about what indicators then to use becomes a very contested and complicated one. One way around that is and you can think about how you use equity indicators. They're useful for different things. So sometimes we use equity or indicators to try to create moral pressure, to signal that something's morally wrong, right? So you might select certain moral indicators to show the depth of an injustice. That's one use of an indicator. Another indicator might be to try to understand the depth of a problem. So you might look at, for instance, the number of people who are vulnerable to something as a different kind of equity indicator. As a scientist in this space, we need indicators because they help us assess progress, they can help us understand the problem, they can help draw attention. But at the same time, trying to come up with a single set of some sort of mathematically decided equity indicators, a lot of us have spent a lot of our lives trying to do this, and it's really not worked. So I would be very thoughtful about why exactly I would ask the question underneath. Why do different people want equity indicators in different ways, and what can those and can they not accomplish? One of the reasons why in the equity group we're working so much on needs is that they're very contextual. And right now, as we turn to a situation where we actually have a lot of the indicators, we have indicators about who's creating emissions, we have indicators about certain kinds of vulnerability, but not all. And that in itself is an injustice. The fact that we do not have good data, for instance, on the children under 5 who are going to be facing very serious climate impacts. We don't have good data on the health implications on most vulnerable populations. If you look at data right now globally, there are whole sections of the globe where you have gray zones where you don't even have any data to track anything at all. That is an equity issue. They don't look like equity indicators, but it is an equity indicator. If you can't even measure how many kids are going to get taken out of school because of climate disasters, if you can't even measure the health impacts on kids under the age of 5, those are equity indicators in their absence. So the reason why in the equity group we're looking at needs is that it gets us away from a very simplistic take on equity, which focuses on a handful of indicators, and it gets us to the real on-the-ground issues that we think are at the heart of equity, which is everyone needs the right to flourish. And without that ability to flourish, you do not have an equitable society. So that's a complicated answer because the equity indicators issue is a really complicated issue. But I would encourage people to always ask themselves deep down, what do I want this indicator for? What am I trying to do with it? And then which indicators are going to help me get there? And right now, in this era of implementation, that's why we're focusing on very, very concrete on-the-ground indicators. Happy to chat further afterwards.
Thank you for the questions and the answers. So maybe we can invite Casey from the Climate Works Foundation for his closing remarks, and Casey Cronin, Director for Global Intelligence of Climate Works Foundations. So he has a short presentation for us.
And actually, I may not really give a presentation. I was just going to reflect back. There's a slide I'll come to in a second. So thank you for it. But I did just want to say, I've had the joy and the privilege of getting to work with these hubs and see them now all grow in different ways. And I think we tried from the beginning to really not prejudge what a GST or IGST regional hub needed to be, which has meant a slower process and a lot of stakeholder engagement and really starting to define that and having 3 hubs that have defined it in somewhat different ways structurally in what they're doing, but also seeing a lot of similarities and actually some of them in the messages from what they were presenting and also here on this panel, some things I just noted from each of the 3 that felt like though they were threads coming across all of them, but was really focusing on how GST outputs can be translated back into the regional and national contexts, understanding that's a real need. That was actually from the Southeast Asia hub, but I think any of the 3 probably would have said that. Looking at public awareness and outreach of the GST to really connect it with people in the region that don't even know this is happening. That was Enrique in the Latin America hub, but I think similar to things Kwame and Danica said also. And then finally, to really think about how to build capacity of organizations and members in the region to ensure more active participation in the GST process, both this one and in potentially future ones. So I think we're excited to see how this really develops as a initiative. The IGST, we'd been building up to 2023, right? There's a process that is happening that culminates at this COP coming up in December, but actually really, it's actually what comes out of that, and the sort of the springboard is the word we've been using, but the action that it incentivizes, it creates, it leads to, it inspires. So we're really looking now to 2024 and 2025 as this window, thinking about how to translate and tailor GST outcomes into national action. So this slide here, which was from a presentation we gave earlier this week, was just some early thinking on that and how we're building now for success later. I think the GST itself is collective in nature. We know that. It's not supposed to call out countries specifically. However, the outputs we think can give clear sectoral and regional implications. That's still ways you can speak collectively without necessarily getting stuck in getting too detailed or too prescriptive for individual countries. Thinking about national buy-in at the national level and conversations that maybe can happen at the regional level to help that happen, including making space for coalitions of the willing, of groups of countries, either at the regional level or in terms of international cooperation that really want to work or lead on key transformations. Sorry, and then the last couple here I think are also important, so I don't want to just read them, but the inclusion of non-party stakeholders, it looks different in this process than I think it does when you get to the regional and national level, but it's still just as important, if not more so, even if the phrase non-party stakeholders may not mean the same thing, but how you're engaging civil society, local government, communities, et cetera. We don't know, but it seems likely we'll see new accountability and implementation mechanisms come out from the UNFCCC and sort of get rolled out in the years ahead. There also is the enhanced transparency framework that is going to come into effect next year as well, and will then feed more into the next Global Stocktake, but I think may help as well to see implementation and delivery. And then finally, we know, both because of some of those extra asks, but just in general, that more targeted capacity building in the regions, in the countries, in communities is just inevitable, and it's going to be a cycle, right? This is not a one-time thing that's going to need to happen after this stocktake. It's just, this is going to need to happen every 5 years with every stocktake, that if this is really the whole world is transitioning, like the whole world has to transition. So these are just a few ideas we've been thinking about. We're very excited for the next 2 years, and even beyond for the hubs. We're not yet thinking about other regional hubs, but hopeful to show sort of proof of concept here with these three. And those are my reflections. Like I said, it's just been a joy and a privilege to see all the work that's gone into this, and now what's flowering from the things that are growing. So thank you, guys. And thank you, Kwame. You can't see me as well, maybe, but.
Okay, thank you, Casey, for the acknowledgement. And so this is the end of our session. So thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much for coming to our sessions.